The first time my mother asked me to help pay for her divorce, she said it so casually that for a few seconds, I genuinely thought she meant paperwork. We were sitting in the waiting area outside a lawyer's office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, while she scrolled angrily through messages from my father and complained about how expensive everything was becoming. I had taken the afternoon off work to drive her there because her car was in the shop again, and for almost 2 hours I listened to her alternate between crying about the marriage ending and ranting about how useless my father had become over the last few years. At some point she sighed, looked over at me, and said, "Well, you're financially stable. Maybe you can help me through some of this." I nodded automatically because the sentence sounded vague enough that I interpreted it as emotional support rather than money. Then she added, "I can't afford these legal fees alone." And the conversation shifted shape entirely. I asked what exactly she meant. She shrugged, just until things settled down. That phrase became important later, because almost every financially manipulative situation inside my family began disguised as temporary survival. Nothing was ever presented as permanent at first. Always just until next month, just until things calm down, just until we recover. The temporary framing made saying no feel cruel every single time. The divorce itself had been building for years. My parents fought constantly toward the end, but in the tired, repetitive way long marriages sometimes decay rather than through dramatic explosions. Most arguments centered around money, though even that became hard to untangle because both of them constantly rewrote reality depending on who they were talking to. According to my mother, my father had become financially reckless and emotionally absent. According to my father, my mother spent compulsively and treated every disagreement like betrayal. The truth sat somewhere between both versions, and by the time divorce entered the conversation officially, everyone in the family had been emotionally exhausted by the whole thing for long enough that nobody seemed surprised. Least of all me, because I had spent most of my adult life functioning as the stable one anyway. I worked in shipping logistics operations for a private transport company near the port. A job that sounds administrative until something breaks and your phone starts ringing at 3 in the morning regardless of what day it is. For almost 10 years, I worked brutal schedules, moving slowly upward inside an industry where the money eventually becomes good, but nobody sees the years beforehand where your body adapts to permanent stress so thoroughly that genuine calm starts feeling suspicious when it finally arrives. Night calls, holiday calls, weekend calls. There were periods where I measured sleep in fragments rather than hours. I missed things, canceled things, spent entire weekends on problems that paid decently but cost something harder to quantify. By 35, I had a decent apartment, savings, no major debt, a reliable car, and enough financial breathing room that emergencies no longer triggered immediate panic. To my family, though stability translated into excess almost automatically. Growing up, money inside our house never really belonged to individuals emotionally. If one person had more, the imbalance became family discussion material by default. My sister Chloe could overdraft her account 3 months straight and still somehow become the victim if anyone questioned her spending, because she was trying her best. If I bought something moderately expensive after months of overtime, somebody commented on whether it was really necessary. Nothing stayed private financially for long. Not salaries, not purchases, not savings. And once my career started improving noticeably in my early 30s, relatives gradually stopped reacting to my financial help with gratitude and started treating it as expectation instead, the way you stop thanking a building for having walls. I understood that shift clearly for the first time about a year before the divorce, during a family dinner where my sister Chloe casually volunteered me to cover part of an Airbnb rental for a cousin's birthday trip before I'd even agreed to attend. When I hesitated, my mother laughed and said, "Oh, please, Marcus can afford it." And the table moved on like nothing strange had happened. I sat staring at my water glass, aware that something had shifted in how my family categorized my resources. Nobody asked whether I wanted to help anymore. My ability to help had quietly become public family property. The divorce accelerated that dynamic badly. At first, I tried supporting both parents fairly, driving my mother to lawyer meetings, helping my father sort banking documents he barely understood, spending weekends mediating conversations neither of them should have pulled me into emotionally. For a while I believed everyone appreciated it. Then the money requests started arriving, each one packaged inside urgency and exhaustion in a way that made hesitation feel like cruelty. The first request sounded reasonable enough. Could I temporarily help cover the consultation retainer because she didn't want my father thinking she was trapped financially? I paid it. Then came utility deposits on the new apartment, then moving costs, then storage fees, then furniture replacements because my father was suddenly claiming ownership over half the existing household items, depending on which argument they were having that week. Every time I paused, even slightly, my mother reframed my hesitation as emotional abandonment. I thought family helped family, or, I wouldn't ask unless I needed it, or the one that always landed heaviest, after everything I've done for you. That last sentence was my mother's sharpest instrument. She used sacrifice like financial currency, converting every childhood memory into evidence during adult disagreements. Food, school supplies, birthday parties, rides to practice. None of it was simply parenting afterward. All of it became debt. The first moment I recognized the situation was becoming genuinely dangerous happened at a Sunday dinner about 2 months into the divorce, when Chloe laughed and said, "Marcus is basically the co-signer on this divorce anyway." The table laughed lightly, actually laughed, and when I looked at my mother waiting to see whether she'd push back on the framing, she simply smiled tiredly into her wine glass and said, "I'd be completely lost without him." That sentence should have sounded appreciative. Instead, it sounded possessive. After that dinner, I started noticing how naturally my mother discussed my finances in front of other people. Nothing as obvious as exact numbers, but enough details that everyone understood I had become part of her financial recovery plan, whether I'd explicitly agreed to that role or not. She mentioned how lucky she was to have a son with stable income whenever relatives discussed rent prices. She referenced my savings during conversations about legal costs. Once, standing outside a cafe near the marina, I overheard her laughing with a friend and saying, "At least one man in my life turned out financially responsible." I laughed along with everyone else, then sat in my car for several minutes afterward because something about hearing myself discussed as financial infrastructure rather than as a person unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Still, I kept helping. Even while recognizing the manipulation becoming more visible, I kept transferring money because the divorce itself remained emotionally chaotic enough that stopping felt cruel every time another crisis appeared. Then the amount started getting larger. The apartment deposit alone was nearly $6,000 because my mother had decided on a newly renovated complex near the waterfront rather than something smaller or more financially realistic farther inland. When I hesitated after seeing the listing, she immediately became defensive. "So, I'm supposed to live somewhere depressing?" I said that wasn't what I meant. "You think I should downgrade my whole life because your father destroyed this marriage?" The conversation escalated so quickly that within 10 minutes, I somehow found myself apologizing for looking surprised at the rent. Meanwhile, Chloe kept reinforcing everything from the sidelines. She called constantly with updates about how fragile Mom seemed and how badly the divorce was affecting her. One evening while I was driving home through heavy rain, she said, 20 minutes into a conversation that had started about lawyer delays, Mom sacrificed her whole life for us, right?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter because that sentence never arrived neutrally in my family. It always meant a financial request was coming immediately afterward. Then, "She's terrified financially. Honestly, I don't know what she'd do without you." That wording bothered me in a specific way. Not without support, not without family, not without help, without you. As if my role inside the situation had already been fixed permanently, and the only question left was whether I understood it yet. A few days later, I found out just how fixed it had actually become in her mind. I stopped by my mother's new apartment on a Saturday with extra shelving I thought she could use. I heard voices inside before knocking and then heard my name, and I froze for a second too long. One of her friends was asking whether she was worried about legal costs rising. My mother answered, "Marcus won't let me drown." The certainty in her voice hit me strangely hard. Not hope, not gratitude, just expectation, the specific tone of someone describing something already decided. Then she laughed softly and added, "He complains sometimes, but he always comes through eventually." Standing in the hallway holding shelving brackets, I understood that my resistance inside the family had become performance rather than boundary. Everyone already believed I would give, and no matter how uncomfortable I got first. And my discomfort had been factored into the timeline as a temporary obstacle rather than a genuine position. I knocked anyway, because leaving silently felt worse somehow. The moment my mother opened the door and saw my face, her expression flickered almost imperceptibly before reorganizing itself into warmth. A micro-expression I had probably seen hundreds of times without identifying it precisely until that afternoon. "You should have texted first," she said casually, which nearly made me laugh out loud, given what I had just overheard in the hallway. Inside the apartment sat two friends drinking wine, surrounded by real estate listings spread across the coffee table. One of them smiled immediately and said, "We were just talking about you. Your mother's so lucky to have such a supportive son." I looked at my mother. She smiled proudly, and there was nothing self-conscious in it, no awareness that anything unusual had just been said, no recognition that the version of me being described as a resource and the version standing in her doorway, holding shelving brackets, were supposed to be the same person. And for the first time since the divorce started, anger appeared underneath the exhaustion clearly enough that I could finally identify it properly. Not because I helped, because she had already emotionally spent my money before asking for it, and she genuinely did not see why that might feel different to me. I stayed for less than an hour. I set up the shelves, answered surface-level questions, declined wine, and left before I said something I had not fully decided to say yet. I started pulling back after that. Not dramatically. I delayed responses to financial requests instead of transferring money within hours, stopped answering every late-night panic call, told my mother I needed clearer expectations before continuing to cover large expenses indefinitely. I want to be honest that this period was not clean or clear-headed. Every time I did not immediately respond, I spent the next few hours second-guessing myself, running the familiar internal calculation. Maybe she genuinely needs this. Maybe I'm being cold. Maybe I'm making a difficult situation worse. The conditioning had run deep enough that even recognizing manipulation clearly did not stop the guilt from arriving on schedule. That conversation happened at a crowded Italian restaurant near the marina because she insisted on talking privately, though her version of private generally meant public enough that nobody could safely raise their voice. I had chosen a table near the back. The conversation stayed careful for the first 10 minutes, both of us managing something rather than saying it directly. Then I asked how much longer she realistically expected me to fund the divorce-related expenses. She stared at me like I had become someone else entirely. "Fund?" she repeated, as though the word itself was the offense rather than the situation it described. I tried explaining carefully that I needed to understand where the line was between temporary help and permanent financial responsibility, that costs kept growing unpredictably, and I honestly did not know what I had agreed to anymore. Her face hardened. "You think I am using you?" I said that was not what I said. She said I did not need to say it. People at nearby tables were already glancing over, because my mother possessed this specific ability to make emotional tension visible before voices fully rose. Then she said, "Somebody has to act like family." And that sentence finally clarified something I had been circling for months. Support was no longer voluntary in her mind. It was obligation. And if I resisted strongly enough, my morality itself became questionable. Then my father showed me the debt statements, and almost everything I thought I understood rearranged itself. He spread the documents across his kitchen table late one Thursday evening while rain hit the windows hard enough that we had to raise our voices to hear each other. The house already looked emotionally abandoned, even though neither of them had fully moved out. Half-empty shelves, missing picture frames, boxes against walls, looking less like a home and more like evidence of a slow disaster. For almost an hour, he walked me through credit card balances, personal loans I had never heard about, furniture financing, luxury store accounts, travel debt, and overdue payments on things that clearly predated the divorce by years. My mother had framed her financial situation as temporary instability caused by legal fees and housing transitions. The reality was that she had been spending far beyond either of their incomes for a long time, and the divorce hadn't created the crisis. It had just made the crisis visible. The most disturbing part was understanding how carefully information had been rationed around me from the beginning. Every time she asked for help, she presented isolated emergencies rather than the full picture, because isolated emergencies sound temporary and systems sound permanent. At some point, my father pushed one of the statements toward me and said quietly, "She already told Chloe you'll probably help refinance some of this." I thought I had misheard him. He said she expected that once the divorce settled, I would help consolidate the debt somehow. The room went silent, except for rain on the windows, because suddenly everything from the previous months rearranged itself into something much uglier and much more deliberate than emotional panic during a difficult divorce. She wasn't trying to survive temporarily. She was trying to secure permanent access to my financial stability before the rest of her life finished collapsing. I drove home feeling physically sick, not angry yet, just hollow, with that particular disorientation that comes when you realize a story you have been living inside was not the story you thought it was. For months, I had been telling myself I was helping my mother survive a crisis. What I was actually doing, without understanding it, was being quietly incorporated into a financial restructuring plan that had been designed around my predictability. My willingness to help had not been appreciated as generosity. It had been cataloged as reliability, which is a different thing entirely, and reliably useful people get planned around rather than asked. The realization sat in my chest all weekend. The Sunday dinner was the end of it. The dinner was framed as bringing everyone together after months of tension, which should have been warning enough, because family gatherings inside my family only became mandatory when someone wanted witnesses. From the second I walked into my aunt's house, the atmosphere felt wrong. Too careful, conversations slightly overmanaged, people watching me at the edges of exchanges. I should have left immediately. Instead, I stayed because some part of me kept hoping the family could survive one difficult period without turning it into organized emotional warfare. About 40 minutes in, my aunt asked whether my mother had signed the lease extension. My mother sighed dramatically and said, "We're trying to figure things out financially. That we landing strangely since it clearly included me without asking me." Then Chloe stepped in. "Honestly, Mom would be okay already if certain people stopped acting like helping family was some kind of burden." The table went quiet. I looked at Chloe. My aunt tried smoothing things over. Chloe kept going. "Marcus acts like Mom is asking for millions when she literally just needs support during the hardest moment of her life." I felt every eye at the table shift toward me, and I noticed my mother wasn't stopping it. She could have. She didn't, because she was letting Chloe build the pressure for her. I set my fork down slowly and said I had already given my mother a lot of support. Chloe laughed sharply and said, "Support? You mean loans you constantly remind her about?" I said I had never once called them loans. She said I acted like my mother owed me. That nearly made me lose my temper, because the reality was completely inverted. Nobody in the family had ever acted like I had any right to limits at all. Then my mother entered the conversation in that soft, wounded voice she reserved for public moments when she needed sympathy positioned against someone else. "Maybe we just raised you differently than I realized." Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. The emotional gravity of the table moved exactly where she'd aimed it. Then she said, "Your own mother is drowning financially, and all you care about is protecting your savings." The table went dead quiet. And for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to make her perspective emotionally understandable before responding. I looked at her directly and said, calmly, "You don't want help. You want ownership." She blinked. I kept going, because after months of confusion and guilt and escalating financial pressure, the truth finally felt simple enough to say out loud. I told her she had already promised people I would cover debts before asking me, that she discussed my finances like family property, that she treated limits like betrayal, and that every time I hesitated, Suddenly I was a bad son rather than a person with a reasonable position. Her face moved from sadness into genuine fury. She said that was not what this was. I said yes it was. She started, after everything I sacrificed, and I interrupted her quietly. There it is. The invoice. The table froze. Nobody moved. I watched my mother completely lose control of the narrative for the first time, and it was uncomfortable to watch because everything she relied on emotionally depended on me staying calm enough to absorb guilt silently rather than describing what was actually happening. Chloe jumped in and called me unbelievable. I looked at her and said what was unbelievable was that everyone at the table had apparently known I would eventually be expected to pay for this divorce before I did. Nobody answered, and that silence told me more than any argument could have. My mother started crying then. Real crying, not the control version. And even then, even after everything, some part of me hated causing it because love survives long after trust starts dying, and that combination is what makes family manipulation so exhausting. She looked at me through tears and said, "So you're abandoning me too." And sitting there surrounded by relatives, untouched food, and months of accumulated weight finally collapsing inward, I understood something devastatingly simple. There was no version of this where I could keep saving her without losing myself completely in the process. I left before dessert. Nobody stopped me, which said everything. I drove home with the windows cracked despite the cold because my chest felt too tight otherwise. By the time I reached my apartment, the family group chat had already started. Chloe had written, "Can't believe how selfish people become once they have money." My aunt had posted something neutral about everyone being stressed. Then my mother sent the message that finally ended everything for me emotionally. "I hope one day you understand what it feels like to be abandoned by your own child." I stared at the screen for a long time after reading it, because that sentence made one thing permanently clear. Not one thing I had already done would ever matter anymore. Not the lawyer fees, not the deposits, not the moving costs, not the weekends mediating conversations, not the thousands already quietly transferred without recognition. The moment I stopped being financially useful without limits, the entire relationship transformed into betrayal in her mind within hours. I muted the group chat. Then I blocked Chloe. I sat with my mother's contact open on the screen for almost 20 minutes because even then, some part of me still wanted one final conversation where she suddenly understood. One honest exchange. One acknowledgement that I was her son before I was a resource. But I already knew that conversation wasn't coming, because if months of escalating pressure and public humiliation hadn't forced any self-awareness yet, one final phone call wasn't going to create it. So eventually I blocked her too. The silence afterward felt horrifying and peaceful at the same time, and that combination unsettled me for weeks. People talk about no contact like it is some cinematic empowerment moment where toxic people disappear and life immediately improves. Real no contact feels more like grief, and not because you missed the manipulation. You mourn the version of the relationship you spent years hoping existed underneath it. The one where the love was uncomplicated and the help went both directions and nobody kept invisible emotional invoices. For the first month, I kept reaching for my phone automatically whenever something funny happened at work or when I passed places my mother used to like. Then I would remember, and that hollow feeling would settle back in. I kept thinking about stupid things, whether she was eating properly, whether the new apartment had enough light, whether she had anyone to call when things felt bad at night. None of those thoughts made the decision wrong. They just made it heavy in the specific way that right decisions sometimes are. Meanwhile, relatives divided quietly. Some stopped contacting me entirely. Some fished for reconciliation while pretending neutrality. A few admitted privately that the financial expectations around the divorce had gotten out of hand, though none of them said that publicly where it would have cost them anything. One cousin sent a message that said something about how I had probably been under a lot of pressure, and maybe when things calmed down we could all reconnect. I read it 3 times trying to find something actionable inside it, and eventually gave up. My father called once, about 3 weeks later. Not to pressure me. I think he called because he was embarrassed and didn't know what else to do with that. We talked about practical things for a while, carefully avoiding the obvious, And then he said something that stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that whole period. She thought you'd always stay. Not just through the divorce. Through everything. I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up, because it explained the whole dynamic more clearly than months of arguments had managed to. For years, my family had treated my stability like permanent infrastructure because I always stayed, always helped, always absorbed pressure quietly, and came back after guilt and conflict and emotional exhaustion. So eventually the sacrifice became invisible to them, and only the availability remained. Those two things look identical from the outside, until one of them ends and suddenly everyone acts surprised. I want to be honest that the weeks after blocking everyone were not particularly peaceful or triumphant. I slept fine, which was its own strange thing to notice. But I also had conversations in my head constantly, versions of things I should have said, things I actually said, things that might have gone differently. I kept drafting messages to my mother in my head late at night and never sending them, which probably says something about the specific kind of hope that survives even after you've accepted intellectually that it's irrational. There were moments where I wondered if I had overreacted, whether the dinner had been more complicated than I had made it, whether years of resentment had made me read the situation harsher than it actually was. Those moments were uncomfortable because I couldn't fully dismiss them. I had genuinely loved my mother. I had genuinely wanted to help her. Those things were true alongside everything else, and the fact that they were true was part of what made the whole situation so exhausting to carry. After the divorce finalized several months later, I heard through relatives that my mother had downsized apartments when she realized the original place was financially unsustainable even with help from extended family. She was apparently managing, not comfortably, but managing, which I felt guilty about hearing in a way that surprised me, because I had understood intellectually that I was not responsible for her financial choices, and yet the guilt arrived regardless, the way it always had. Part of me probably always will feel some version of that. That is the uncomfortable reality nobody talks about clearly with family estrangement. Sometimes the people who hurt you are genuinely hurting too, and those two things exist simultaneously without either of them canceling the other out. My mother was manipulative and financially exploitative. She was also a person who had made genuinely bad decisions over many years and found herself at 62 starting over alone in a smaller apartment than she had planned on. Both things were true. Understanding that complexity did not make me regret the decision. It just meant I could not feel clean about it either, and I eventually accepted that the choice between a damaged relationship and a damaged version of myself was not a choice between two easy things. It was just a choice. About 6 months after the dinner, I ran into one of her friends near the marina while grabbing coffee before work. She looked uncomfortable recognizing me, then sighed and said, "Your mother still talks like she can't believe you abandoned her over money." I remember standing there holding a hot cup while cargo cranes moved slowly across the harbor behind her, and for the first time since everything collapsed, I felt tired rather than defensive hearing the story distorted. Because underneath all the rewritten versions, the truth remained painfully simple. I did help. A lot. It just eventually became clear that no amount would have felt like enough once access replaced gratitude. That evening I came home, cooked dinner, answered a few late emails from Singapore operations, and sat on the balcony watching distant traffic move through the city below. The silence around me actually belonged to me completely for the first time in longer than I could precisely date. No financial emergencies pending. No emotional invoices arriving in notifications. No particular version of my future being planned somewhere without my knowledge. Just the harbor lights and the sound of the city doing what cities do, indifferent to any of it. I sat there for longer than I needed to, just because I could, because the time was mine and I did not owe an explanation for how I used it. I still think about my mother sometimes. Not constantly, not with the same weight as before, but in the way you think about something that shaped you without your consent. I hope she's okay, genuinely. I hope the smaller apartment has enough light. I hope she found people to have dinner with. Those things are true at the same time as everything else that is true, and I have stopped needing them to cancel each other out before I can sit with any of it. What I finally understand, after all of it, is something I wish I had learned years earlier. Some families do not confuse love with money accidentally. They confuse them because money is easier to control than love, and controlling the people you love is easier than risking the kind of relationship where they could actually leave. The moment you stop funding the role they constructed for you, they call your limits abandonment, instead of finally acknowledging that the relationship was always conditional. What changed was not that I stopped caring. What changed was that I stopped being willing to prove I cared in the only currency they accepted.